snapshot of like how it is that we got to this place of learning with each other. You know, I got called in as a sub, as a ringer, to teach Talmud back when the initial Talmud group was just making it, not just, but was making its way kind of chronologically through the first tractate of the Talmud, through the tractate of Brachot, the tractate that's about blessings. And we were just reading through and kind of conversing and learning and paying attention to the different pieces there. And so at some point, people got tired of doing that, and we moved on to looking at kind of more thematic areas and really great stories and legends from the Talmud. And eventually I noticed that the same question kept coming up over and over and over again, variations on the same question. And the question was, how do we get from point A that the Talmud is describing to point Z, which is what Judaism looks like today? Sometimes they overlap, very rarely. Normally there's a huge gap between the two. And that question kept coming up, like, well, I know we do X today, but where does that come from? And so it's a great question. In fact, it's like the animating question of being a rabbi, and kind of always has been. And so we kind of shifted and started looking more at not just the Talmud, but everything that gets from the Talmud up to today. And the way we looked at that last year was through the question of, can you mix chicken and dairy? Can you have chicken parmesan? Because today, if you're somebody who keeps kosher according to kind of standard laws of kashrut, the answer is no. But if you look in earlier sources, the answer seems to be yes. And so how do you get from A to Z on that? So it was very fascinating, lots of vibrant disagreement. And in some cases, the actual topic is immaterial, right? It's more about understanding how have Jews made decisions through space and time, right? In different communities and in different eras, both kind of indigenously to our own texts and values, and also in response to what's happening to us around the world. So that's what being Jewish is, right? That's kind of navigating, holding on to this very ancient tradition, and also figuring out how to apply it to the circumstances around us. Now, the thing is, there are varying degrees of where you can land on that spectrum, from I just do what my rabbi tells me to at one end, and then somewhere else, maybe it's not ends, right? Maybe it's a constellation to I just do what my rabbi tells me to I do what I intuit feels right to me, to I really don't do any of this at all, but still consider myself Jewish, to I'm spending time learning and trying to dive in and wrestle with and tackle with the sources, which is what all of you are, which is great. And it's also, I would say, like the community that I was raised in encouraged me on that road. So this is still a class in Talmud, right? However, one of the things that happens when you learn Talmud is you realize you need to know so much more, right, than just what is on the page. There is a value in learning Talmud for its own sake, and in understanding what are the stories and conversations and debates and teachings that emerge from the Talmud. But if what you want to know is, how do I apply that to my practical life today, or to a life of values today, you can't do it just on its, or I would say, I don't want to overstate that. It's rare that you could just do that just on its own. You have to study something, you have to zoom out and look at a lot more. And that's where we're at. So this round of the class is still kind of like grounded in Talmudic sources, but it's going to use the same principle of kind of really zooming out and looking at kind of what else is going on. And if you read I hope you read the description that I sent out. I'm responding to another one of the questions that has come up basically since I kind of like slid in here and got called in, which was like, what's the, where are the women in all of this? Where's the feminist response to all of this? Where is the acknowledgement of the impact of and role of and focus on women? Now, I am not a woman, and I should also say that this is not my area of expertise at all. There are people who are much, much more learned in this, but I learn from them also. So I'm sure I will come back and repeat this caveat over and over again, but just to understand that like my skin in the game is different than other people's. But I think like this tradition belongs to all of us, and we're all able to study these texts and look at them and kind of grapple with what do we do with this? How do we pull out meaning and guidance and practice? So the specific area. So I've said that like this is a question that has kept coming up, was like what is the yes, I will send a description next week when I send out like the actual sources that we're going to be looking with. The specific area of life related to women that somebody asked about, actually, Don, I think it was you, right at the end of last year or the spring, was about the area of Jewish practice called tznius, which is often translated as modesty, and we're going to learn right away that's an insufficient translation, and is often understood to be kind of what are the laws of kind of behavior and decorum and presentation incumbent on women, right? And one of the things that we're going to learn is that is an entirely insufficient description, that it applies not only to women, but to everyone. And that modesty is probably not the best translation. So if you've heard about tznius before, if you have people in your family or friend group who would say that they observe tznius or practice tznius, or tzniut, if they're feeling particularly Hebrew oriented. If this is something that you're familiar with, we're going to turn it on its head and learn what it's really about. And if it's not something that you're familiar with, I think it's actually like a really interesting, and I would say in liberal Jewish circles, entirely misunderstood and entirely understudied. It was absolutely not a part of any education that I received growing up Jewishly. It was not taught in, it was taught in like one class in rabbinical school, but from a more kind of like academic and distant perspective. So I think it's going to be really rich and really interesting for us to see something that has been misunderstood and has been looked at kind of controversially, particularly through a liberal Jewish lens. And so I'm hoping that it'll be like really fascinating and really rich for us, especially because and this is a comment to everyone who studied last spring with me. If you want to know the laws of kashrut, of keeping kosher, it's fairly easy to find where to go, right? In the canon of Jewish texts, it's not that hard. All of the laws of kashrut kind of show up in the same places, right? You can imagine if there was an encyclopedia of Jewish law, which there is, you could turn to the section called kashrut and just like go to it, right? And find it. You can't do that with this question of tznius, which again, and I'll say in English and put it in scare quotes, often translated as modesty, but that's absolutely not how we're going to understand it and translate it. We'll learn it's much more rich and complex than that. So that's actually going to make it fun for us, because if you think back to how I opened and said, if you really want to understand Jewish practice and thought and philosophy, you can't just pick and choose. You can't just study one tiny little chunk and think that you've got the whole grasp. You really need to zoom out and look at a very wide field. And that's one of the things that we're going to see in this topic, in this area of Jewish thought and practice, is just how wide, almost like a constellation, that we're assembling pieces from to turn into what looks like a familiar practice to most today. Yeah, if I were to spell it in English, I would say Tznius is the kind of Yiddish inflected version of it, the Ashkenazi version, or tzniut would be the Hebrew version. Yeah. Okay. So even if you've never learned this or heard this, I'll just describe, as it relates to women, some of the practices which you might be familiar with associated with this. We're not going to do any learning on this today, just so that people kind of know what's ahead of us, right? Covering your hair when you go out around people who aren't your spouse, with either a wig or a hat of some sort, not touching people of the opposite sex, wearing clothes of a certain kind of cut and length, right? Kind of the way that you speak and present yourself to other people. These are all kind of behaviors that fall under this rubric of tznius or tzniut or modesty, again in the scare quotes. And those are all the kind of like outwardly, right? Everything I just said was kind of like very visual, and I saw nodding heads. You're like, oh yeah, I've heard of that before. I've seen that before. And one of the things we're going to learn is that it is actually mostly an inward orientation. It's actually mostly about kind of how you look at yourself as a human being, and then use that to make decisions on how you interact with other people. And again, I'll just emphasize, and then we'll pop this aside, is not actually related only to women, even though in more strictly observant circles, that's often how it is, I would say, erroneously presented. So that's what we're going to look at. Is very wide and very deep. I think it's going to be very exciting, and I have no doubt there will be many disagreements and questions about kind of where this all comes from and how it plays out. So we're not going to dive into the content of that today, because we want to do a little more kind of setting the stage in terms of kind of what we can expect and kind of bringing us up to par on what are the different texts we're looking at, what's some of the terminology that's going to be common, etc. That sound okay? I'm going to, after I hiccup, share my screen. Let me just make sure this presentation is rolling. It is, okay. So when you want to know how and why Jews do what we do, okay, one of the things we're talking about is halacha. And halacha is typically translated as Jewish law. It comes from the root holech, to walk or to go, or the path. So it is even in its just definition, you can understand that it's a system that is related to how you carry yourself and how you move through the world. I would say that how do I want to say this? While many people, and I'm sure lots of people in this room are familiar with this perspective, while many people present halacha as if it is a closed book from which you can just go and find the answer to the question that you have, that is not actually how it functions, right? And my saying that is not an especially like liberal point of view on halacha. I think that is a perspective that is presented by the idea of Jewish law itself. There's not one closed collection of Jewish law. It evolves over time. It evolves through specific methods. So it's not anything goes. There are certain ways that change happens, but it is something that evolves and grows through time. So that's the first thing to know, that when we're talking about halacha, it's not just simply Google the answer, although that's getting increasingly easier. Right? It's getting increasingly easier. The way that you would find the answer to the question, why do Jews do X, right, would be to zoom out first and get as wide a view of the picture, and then zoom in and look at like, well, what are the like all of the tiny little components, right, that make something up. So this bears saying because many liberal communities do not behave and do not organize themselves in terms of pedagogy and curriculum around this idea. So this is really important to say. If all you ever do is read the Torah or the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, you're not getting the full picture. Right? You're not understanding the broadness, the breadth of how to act Jewishly, right? A single verse from the Torah or the Tanakh is not on its own a Jewish value. Right? A single verse from the Torah or the Tanakh is not on its own a Jewish value. It can be the seed and the spark behind it, but on its own, you have no other picture of how that's been interpreted and grown through thousands of years. Likewise, a single verse or from the Torah is not on its own, with some very notable exceptions, like a halacha, right? A law. It's not, right? Even something that we might think is straightforward is like observe Shabbat, right? Or don't murder. Those are single verses from Torah that we've all read, right? Year after year after year. But on their own, that is not the expansiveness of Jewish law. Right? So the traditional answer to, okay, well then how do we know what to do? The traditional answer is that when the Torah was revealed at Mount Sinai, accompanying it was the evolution of Jewish law. And that's where you get the concept that there are two Torahs, the oral Torah, or the written Torah, which is the Torah in the scroll, and the oral Torah, which is the generations of commentary and interpretation of that. That's the traditional answer, that it was all by design. It was kind of baked into the giving of the Torah. And while I'm not sure if I entirely believe this, there is logic to it, right? There is a certain internal coherence to that like, how can you give people an instruction book that actually doesn't include all of the instructions, right? There had to be something else, right? That's like internally coherent. Here's another metaphor for those of you who are driving in a car thinking about this. If something happens to the car and you have to pull over, God forbid, you're going to get here, it's going to be fine. But if something happens and you need to know how it works, you can open up the glove box and pull out the driver's manual. Right? That will give you like a general orientation to how the car works, how it functions, kind of all the different parts and pieces to that. But if you need to make a repair, if you need to understand actually what's happening in the car, it's useless, right? It is not going to help you. And when you take your car to the shop, they have a much bigger book, which is the parts manual to your car, which tells you what every single thing in the car does, right? How it functions, how it works, how it interacts with every other piece of the car, right? How to replace it if something goes wrong, what its purpose is, right? And we don't have that. Most of us are not capable of, we really wouldn't understand it if we opened it up and read it. That's another metaphor for thinking about the difference between written Torah, which lots of us are familiar with, and oral Torah, this much more expansive thing. The difference when we come into the Jewish space is we actually are equipped to study the oral Torah. Right? We actually do have the skills and the ability to do that. It's harder, right? It takes more effort, but that's why we're here, and that's why we're learning together. Alex, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Rabbi. I love the example of the car. So if I can extend it a little bit, even though you may have those two manuals, you still don't know how to drive. Those manuals don't teach you how to drive, and they don't teach you either the code to operate the car in the streets, right? What is the transit code? And even if you read all that, until you actually drive the car, okay, you really don't know how to drive a car. And even if you did drive the car, you have to always facing new situations that will increase your knowledge of what driving a car really means.
That's great. What a great way to extend the metaphor. Yeah, so good. That worked so well. Thank you. Yeah, Peter.
I want to take us back a little bit to your introduction of the term modesty. And when we were studying the laws of kashrut, we started with a verse, actually 3 verses in Torah, and we moved from there to Talmud, to various other law codes and so on. I'm wondering if there is any single verse or multiple verses in Torah which describe, and I'm going to use the term modesty. Or am I jumping ahead too far?
You are jumping ahead. That's the question that we're going to look at. But I'll use your question as just like a re-emphasis of this point and why this class looks the way it does. And that's if the Torah on its own was lucid enough and clear enough to tell you exactly not just like what you needed to do, right? Like the parts manual, but also taught you how to drive. You wouldn't need everything else, right? You wouldn't need the entire body of rabbinic literature. You wouldn't need it. And it's just not the case, right? You could have like a challenge with someone to say like, point me to like the one verse that tells, right? Like even something like the Shema. What does it mean to love God? What does that mean, right? How do you do that with all your heart and mind and might? I don't know what that means. I mean, it sounds lovely as a value. We say it 2-3 times a day, but that doesn't, like, what does that even mean? And that's why you have thousands of years of Jewish theology and philosophy trying to figure that out. Right? So
sorry, Jesse, to interrupt, but that just makes my point. Certainly, the study of Kashrut, which we did last year, started from you should not boil a kid in his mother's milk, and went way off on many tangents to define what all that meant. But it still started from one phrase in Torah. So I go back to my question. Is there one phrase or more than one phrase in Torah itself that starts the conversation?
Great. Come back next week. Tune in same time next week to find out the answer to that question. The reason it's also it's a great question on its own related to what we're learning, but conceptually it's good because, and here's something that we probably have to do a little unlocking in our minds. If you want to know the answer to the question, why do Jews do X? Typically, the way you would begin is not by starting at the source, not by starting at Torah, but by starting at the most recent collection of answers to that and working backwards. So, Peter, you're illustrating by reminding us what we did last fall, like last year, which was to start at the source and work our way forward. And that's very interesting from like, we didn't study it only academically, but like from a more intellectual perspective, that's interesting so that you can see the evolution of something through time. But the only reason we were able to do that as a group is because I had done the opposite. I had started most recently and worked all the way back to the beginning, right? And that's typically, when we talk about studying halakha and Talmud and Jewish practice and Jewish ritual and Jewish philosophy, you actually start at the most recent period in time and see like what are people writing about, what sources are they quoting, and what are they pointing to, and then you work your way all the way back, right? And so we're going to do a little bit of both this round. We're going to go kind of in both directions, and actually, because that can be very disorienting, one of the things that I wanted to start us off with was actually understanding what are these periods in Jewish history, like what are they in the lives of the rabbis and the lives of Jewish law and thought. What are these different moments in time? Because it's going to be really helpful for us to understand kind of who and where we're talking about. So I'm going to present this, and I will share this out afterwards. So don't worry. This is not how I want to do this. Okay. Slide only. This is what I want. Okay. Everybody can see the slide? Yeah, does it look good? Great. Okay. Bum, 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 bum. Is there a thing covering it on the right, or can you see the whole slide? You can see the whole slide. Perfect. Okay, great. So one of the ways that, no, before we even start that, this is still a class in Talmud. So let's see what different rabbis through the eras have said about Talmud. So, of course, it's not letting me skip through the slide. Hang on. Okay, we're gonna have to use the little navigator thingy. Okay, we're good. So here's one point of view. This is Maimonides, the Rambam. He says all of Israel agrees in the authority of the Bavli. The Bavli is the word for Babylon, Babylonia, and it's the word, one of the words for the Babylonian Talmud. And so Maimonides, important, critically influential 11th century philosopher, scholar, commentator on the whole Mishnah, wrote a huge compendium of Jewish law, which we will absolutely be reading with each other. In his introduction to his compendium of Jewish law called the Mishnah Torah, which means the second Torah, which tells you how highly he thought of himself, he says, all of Israel agrees in the authority of the Babylonian Talmud. Now, this, of course, there was no convention where everybody arrived or sent delegates, right, to agree on this. It did not happen kind of democratically by any stretch of the imagination, but there was a gradual form of consensus, right? It was a gradual form of, it's certainly majority, and if not majority, then some form of consensus that the Jewish people accepted upon ourselves through ascension, that the Babylonian Talmud is authoritative, right? And the point here, especially as we contrast this with kind of what some other people say, is that it's the people who made it authoritative, right? Now he believes it's also ultimately of divine origin, right? But the question is to like, how is it that we have these texts preserved in the way that we do, and why do we do these things? One of his perspectives is that when we're studying the Talmud, one of the reasons we do it is because we are the ones who decided to do it. Right? We have all ascended to the authority of it, given ascension to the authority of it. Here's another opinion. This is by Abraham ibn Daud, who's a Spanish Jewish, a medieval Spanish Jewish astronomer and a historian. He lives in Cordova, so in Spain, in the early 12th century. And he says, all Israel accepted it upon themselves, right? So just like the Rambam said. And he says, the sages taught it in public. All of Israel agreed upon it. Nothing can be added or subtracted to it. So he kind of tweaks this just a little bit. But one of the things that he adds to it is the idea that it's a closed canon. Now, he didn't come up with this idea, but the idea that it's a closed canon is important to know, that when you're looking at Jewish history, already by the early 12th century, there's the idea that the Torah and that the Talmud are done, right? That like as a canon or as a quote unquote book, that nothing's going to be added anymore. And this is a really important question because as we'll see when we read Talmud, the conversation stretches across time and space, right? We read people in the year 0, and we read people who, lived around maybe the year 500 or 600. So there's a wide range of time and events happening. When did it happen that stopped, right? Why is it that the Talmud seems to stop around a certain point in terms of the stories we read? And Abraham ibn Daud, he didn't invent this idea, but he shares it, is that at some point it ends. The Talmud itself says that at some point in time it's closed, which is a nice kind of little like meta existential question of like, well, how did that happen, right? How is it aware of its own finishing, right? So here's another idea. There is nobody who disagrees with it, right? This is by Rav Shrira Gaon. Gaon means, is a term that's used to refer to the head of the Babylonian academies, right? So the yeshivas that existed in Babylonia, so in like today's Baghdad and Fallujah today, not places with any Jews, unfortunately, but places that were once literally the center of the Jewish world of scholarship and practice. The heads of the yeshivas there were known as Gaon. Gaon means genius. And Rav Shrir was the head of one of those academies, and he's the head of the academy at a place called, let me put it into the chat because it's fun to say, Pumbedita, which is in Fallujah, today's Fallujah, and one of the largest Jewish yeshivas in the world. And he's one of the most prominent of the Geonim, which is the plural of Gaon. He's one of the most prominent heads of the yeshivas. And one of the texts that he wrote was a comprehensive history of the composition of the Talmud. And he put it down in a letter that he sent off to a faraway Jewish community. And he's born in the year 906. So that also tells you something. Already by the year, so first of all, there's nobody who disagrees with it. Has he read the Talmud? Right? He's not saying that there aren't disagreements in it. He's saying that when it comes to the authority of the Talmud, nobody disagrees that it is an authoritative text. So already by the year 900, which is not too far from like the accepted closing date of the Talmud, there's already the idea that it has achieved kind of ascendance and authoritative hold amongst the Jewish people. Here's another idea. We no longer have scholars on whom we can rely about the authority of the text itself. We no longer have scholars who we can rely about the authority of the text. This is by Rabbi Meir Abulafia. He's a major Sephardic and halachic authority in medieval Spain in the late 12th and early 13th century. And this is really important, what he's saying here. He's kind of self-reflecting on his own authority. And what he's saying is, my generation is no longer as reliable as previous generations. My generation is not as authoritative or reliable as those who came before me. Now, what's the upshot of that? Therefore, the text must be considered reliable. So this is something, a concept that's known as the decline of the generations, and the idea that as you go back in Jewish time and get closer to the sources of rabbinic authority, kind of reliability and authority and weight increases as you go further back in time. So you should say to yourselves right now, well, wait a minute. Didn't you say that if we want to know how we do something, we start most recently? Yes, we do start most recently. So there's a bit of a challenge here of like, if you're always getting worse, what does that mean is incumbent on you? Worse is not the right word. If you're always declining in authority, what does that mean about your responsibility to knowledge acquisition? You might think a good metaphor for this is like, what happens when you make I'm dating myself. What happens when you make a VHS copy of something, right? The quality goes down a little bit. And then what happens if you make a VHS copy of the VHS? It goes down more. And if you keep making those VHS copies, and you can find videos on YouTube of people who do this, because of course, eventually you get to a point where you can't see the original material. It's gone, right? The data is just completely scrambled. And so that's where we reach the limits of that metaphor, because we will never kind of lose the core and the essence, but the image is the same. That Abulafia's idea is that the source is the most authoritative and the most important, and that we're actually declining as we come away from there. So I'll give just a couple more, and then we'll do one more, and then we'll do some questions. This is the Rashbam's idea. The Rashbam is Rashi's grandson, lives in kind of Franco-Germany in the Middle Ages. And he says all of the words of the Talmud Bavli, of the Babylonian Talmud, were written to be halacha lama'aseh. Halacha lama'aseh means practical halacha, meaning it's not kind of philosophy of law. It's not values-based. He's saying everything that you read, all of the words of Talmud are meant to be a practical guide for what to do. That's his idea. Now, that in itself is a philosophical statement, because that's plainly not true, or at least on we might want to say, like, Rashbam, why do you think that? There is so much in the Talmud that is not telling you just what to do kind of straightforwardly. So he's making an argument to say even the parts of the Talmud that don't appear to be oriented in that way have something to tell you about how to direct your life. So here we have kind of a range of different opinions on the authority of the Talmud, right? That it was all of us together kind of who accepted its authority, or that because of the decline of generations, we have to go back to the source just as a practical matter. There are ideas that it's a closed canon. And all of this is happening kind of not too long after the kind of, scholars generally say somewhere like the 700s is a good date to peg the end of the Talmud, kind of like the coalescing of it into the state that we have it today. So it's not that long after. So already there appears to be an acknowledgement of the importance and the status of the Talmud. The problem is the period from the end of the Talmud itself up until then is a black hole. We do not know a lot about it at all. There are not records from that time. There are not kind of like self-conscious reflective writings for that time. Obviously, the Talmud doesn't have anything to say about it because it's after kind of the ending of the de facto ending of the Talmud. And so we don't know what happened in that period. It's very shadowy. And we'll learn some of the reasons why, right? There are some kind of like geopolitical reasons why we don't know. But that's why it's interesting to ask this question, like, how have people accepted the Talmud over time? Because there's this gap in our knowledge where we can't rewind the tape, and we don't know what was happening there. And we don't know how we got from clearly the end of this collection of texts to by the point where people are starting to say, we've all accepted this upon ourselves. Okay, there's lots of hands coming up. I have to introduce two concepts, and then we're going to go to hands. One of them is the one that we just looked at, we heard. Halichta kabatre. This means the halacha is according to the earliest ones. That's that idea of if there's a decline of generations, when we ask the question, how do we know what to do? We go with the earliest source. So one of the ways of thinking of the question, why is it that Jews do X, is to say, like, give all of our texts a vote, right? Give everybody a vote, and then bring them all together and tally up the votes. Right? That's kind of one metaphor for thinking about how we answer these questions. And the philosophy of halichta kabatre means that whoever came first, their vote is worth more. And to an extent, this is not untrue. My vote is not worth as much as Rabbi Hillel of the Mishnah, right? It's just not, right? If I were to say to you, don't do unto others as you want them to do unto you, so says Rabbi Jesse, right? Treat everybody like a jerk, right? All right, I have an ounce of rabbinic authority. I guess I can tell people that. But if you were to look at the canon of Judaism and say, like, oh, but there's this guy, this Hillel, who says kind of the exact opposite. Hillel's vote is worth more than my vote is worth, right? And the reason for that is because of the principle halichta kabatre, that the halacha is according to the earliest ones. However, at some point in Jewish history, the scales tip, and we move away from this philosophy to halacha ka'achronim. The halacha is according to the later ones, or the most recent text. And the reason for this is, as Jewish law and texts and teachings accrue and accrue and accrue over time, there's more and more and more. And that makes it harder to work your way back to the source. So, Peter, here's a little bit of a response to the question you pointed. It's hard to find that the initial point. It's very, very hard right now to find it with integrity. And because it's hard to do that, there is also the philosophy of you follow the most recent text. Now, this would vary from community to community, like who is the most recent authority that you trust and who carries weight in your community. But this is kind of the dominant principle today, that like you have to trust the most recent person, and that's a function of the world changes and we need to adapt, right? So again, like even just this principle on its own is enough to put to bed the assumption that halacha never changes. Of course it changes, right? It itself is aware that change happens over time. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. We've got some more texts to look at, but let's go Peter, Alex, Larry.
Actually, it's Joy.
Joy, Alex, Larry.
The one statement that was made, which was that we have no scholars today good enough as was in the past. I find that very very insulting, because we know that in each generation there will always be great minds and great thinkers. To say so abruptly that that's not so, I can't imagine he made a lot of friends.
It's a good point, right? Like, so like the psychology of that is fascinating. Like, what does it mean to always think that you're never as good as the people who came before you? And that's one, right? We just saw the other point of view, which was, yes, but you also have to trust those, right? At some point, the scales kind of tip, but I would say both operate kind of in productive tension with each other, right? When we think of like the great philosophers and thinkers of our time, it's hard to think of contemporary people, and we often like look backwards right behind us, not exclusively, and that's why you have the other opinion, which is like, yes, but we need to stay current also, right? Which is where you get the tip. But yeah, thanks for pointing out like the emotional impact of that. Peter, no, Alex. Oh, but please unmute.
Thank you. Now, I think I had two questions. One, I think it was on slide 7, and the other, I already forgot the second one. But on slide 7, I think it's the one on the Rashbam, right?
Yeah, all the words of the Talmud Bavli were written to be practical halacha. Yeah.
Yes. So I wonder, sorry, I think I heard you said, where is this thing about we have to go and study, right? And part of me thinks, well, the word halacha, Shema Paula of, going is the path, or the going itself, right? As a noun. It's exactly that. Is the F word of. And in this case, it is to me very clear that the Talmud is not a just do it, because in every paragraph you have, just do it this way, but then just do it the other way, or maybe
exactly.
A third, right? So it's definitely not a user's manual.
Exactly.
If anything, it gives you the intention of, now you have to study all this, and now you have to form an opinion, which in the end makes me question this. Yeah, that was the second question. Makes me question this thing about who's right, because timeliness cannot make an argument right. Okay, whether it's the Achronim or the Rishonim, it doesn't matter. Either could be wrong. Both were human beings. So isn't it
great
imposed upon us to learn, understand, study the differences of opinion, form one, and act accordingly?
Great. Alex is referring to two of the generations of rabbinic authority, the Rishonim, which means the earliest ones, and the Achronim, which means the more recent ones. And I have to say, and it pains me to say it, but Alex, your point of view is so postmodern, right? In fact, it's so postmodern, it's postmodern, which the kids tell me you can call popomo, meaning we have the ability, us postmoderns, and it kills me because whatever, we have the ability to look across time and acknowledge relativity. That is not something that the earlier rabbis could do. The concept didn't exist, right? The earlier the earliest rabbis, Rashi, right? Not amongst the earliest rabbis. Rashi did not, who lived in France in the 11th century, 12th century. He had historical perspective. He knew that at one point in time people did one thing, and at another point in time people did another thing. But he didn't have this like kind of ability to say, and like, how are they relatively true, and what are the historical forces impacting on all of them, and what weight do we ascribe to all? That's not how it's not how people thought, and it's certainly not how Jews thought about law. Now we can do that, and we can kind of look at the big picture and zoom out. And in fact, we're entering we're not entering, we're in a really like remarkable, kind of the most exciting period of Jewish scholarship ever, because we can do this. It's like the only thing that the internet is good for, with an ability that, I can't emphasize this enough. There is no other point in Jewish history where people have been able to do what we can do today when it comes to studying Jewish text. Period. So anybody who says that, like, oh, but the decline, right? Yeah, sure. Okay, there might be a decline in individual scholarship, but in terms of the tools that we have access to, I'll say it again, there has never been a better moment to be someone interested in the Talmud and Jewish learning. It is just simply astonishing, the access that we have to texts in translation, right? Let alone in their sources, but like also in translation, which is remarkable. Rashi just couldn't look at things in that way, right? Because humans didn't. We just didn't have that, philosophy of time. But yes, it's worth pointing out that like there's clearly, we're not just talking about people who lived at different points in time and had different thoughts. They also, I don't want to say it, they also had different abilities to think of things. Meaning, Rashi, although some people like to imagine him as like a proto-feminist because he told his daughters they could wear tefillin, would not have brought that framework or that lens, right? He just didn't have the ability to, because it didn't, conceptually just didn't exist. So it's not enough to say that like Rashi lived at a time when women had fewer rights. That's true. He also lived at a time when people didn't even have the capacity to think in that way, right? Which we can say because we are postmodern, right? Okay. Larry.
First, Jesse, let me preface this by saying that my own term for the Mishnah Torah is rabbinic BS. Okay, that's just where I come from on this. All right?
Well, you're in good company for Maimonides friends who also thought that.
It's precisely because of that. No, you got to listen to the research. No, it's the Achronim. No, chicken parmesan is not kosher. Yes, it is. And yet it's all correct. I mean, so I have a problem with that. And my biggest problem is that it was, quote, closed off. That at some point the Talmud said, it's over, these are the rules forever and ever and ever. And today you still have the black hats down at Bathurst and Lawrence. And you have us in Reform Judaism, liberal Judaism, where we can actually think for ourselves and look at these laws and say, maybe not. I don't think the rabbis of the Talmud ever foresaw something like Reform Judaism. As you say, it's an exciting time. We can do this. We can go online and talk to each other from all sorts of different places and discuss these things, and that would never have happened back in the days of Rambam and etc. But I really have a problem. My major problem with Talmud is that it declared itself closed.
Yeah, it did. Like it itself, right? There's a part of the Talmud. So I mean, the Talmud is not chronological, right? So you can't just go to like the last page and it says the end. It doesn't say that. But within the Talmud, there is the opinion. It says sof hora'ah, right? The end of instruction, right? And so the Talmud seems to be aware that it itself finished, but we don't. And this is not the kind of our direct area of learning. What we're learning about is what's the impact of that, right? What is the impact of having that multivalent, multivocal discussion have it closed, and now we are the bearers of that? I see it as my part of my personal mission to rehabilitate our Jewish peers across the ideological spectrum, and like the kind of like the movements and the institutions that we are all familiar with, right? Things like Reform and Conservative and Orthodoxy, those are all modern movements, right? They were all invented in Germany in the 17th and 18th century, in the 18th and 19th century. And look, I'm not someone who follows those lines. I appreciate that other people do and derive great meaning from it. And I think that like those movements have done great work. This is not a class in sociology, so I'll end there. What I will say is the institutional organizations and movements that we are all familiar with, for me, this is my point of view, so only take this as my personal perspective, have ceased their usefulness in determining the scope of Jewish learning. Meaning, we are at a point in Jewish history where it doesn't matter if you're Hasidic, it doesn't matter if you're Haredi or Reform or Conservative or Modern Orthodox or Open Orthodox or Feminist Orthodox. You have access to the entire canon of Jewish knowledge in a way that nobody else before us has. And there is one model that tries to keep that segmented amongst these institutions that were invented in Germany in response to modernity in Europe. And there's another point of view, mine, which says, who cares? Right? Like, isn't it awesome that we have the ability to read and learn and study all, this amazing, rich diversity of Jewish, this wealth of Jewish thought and teaching that we are standing on the shoulders of and that we are the bearers of, in a way that really sadly and tragically had been kept from us because we thought that it was what the other people did, right? Or we thought it's not what women are allowed to do, right? And that's really tragic. And I think, thank God that is not the world anymore, right? I'm very grateful for that, and that's certainly the orientation that I bring. One of the things that I would say, as we think about the people who I imagine, just looking at the room, who I imagine are to our ideological, theological right on the false binary of the left-right spectrum, is be careful of overstating what people think and believe. There is remarkable diversity in Orthodox Judaism, and because of the topic that we're studying, we're going to see that. We're going to encounter that directly. And also, one of my points is that I'm not making a liberal argument. I'm not using the Talmud and Halacha to forward liberal Jewish arguments. I'm saying that many of those perspectives are included in the text itself, right? In terms of evolution and change and diversity of thought. It's all constrained within a certain system, but they're all there. This is not just me as a person coming in and swooping in and saying, hey, you can change whatever you want. It's not me, right? Just want to make sure my cards are on the table and people know who I am. Other people want to do that, we can have the debate with them. That's okay. Okay, great. Mom, your hand is up. You haven't said anything.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to what Larry was saying about how you feel about the rabbis of the Talmud. And I think what Jesse was saying earlier about relying on the most recent authorities first, you would probably be more comfortable with that, depending on which authority you're consulting, of course. But I think there was that realization that although we can say that the Talmud was codified and ended and that's it, we know that there are many unresolved arguments in the Talmud that sometimes they come to a consensus and will say, and this is the halakha. But there's also, we saw some last year, there's also instances where there was no definitive decision handed down. So we now have the advantage of all of the commentators and halachists who came after the Talmud to help us make those decisions that the rabbis didn't make.
Yeah. And that, again, just to flog my horse, that access, while it has always been there, the people themselves who had the access were much narrower than today, which is why it's just really we have as much doom and gloom as there rightfully is in our world right now, in our Jewish world. That is one thing that is just astoundingly, we should all be proud of and excited of and deeply grateful that this is when we are. Okay, so here's what I want to say. We've got 4 minutes left. I'm going to tell you what's coming up next, and then we'll finish with whoever wants to share. So next week we're going to look at those different periods in time. So we've heard some allusions to them. So next week we'll continue this kind of broad introductory look at like, well, what are the different periods in Jewish time, and like what are they thinking of, and how are they functioning, and who are the rabbis there? And then we'll return to the Talmud itself, and just as a kind of a refresher or an introduction, we'll say, like, well, when we're talking about the Talmud, what are we actually talking about? Like, what does it look like? Kind of what are the different conversations that are in relationship with each other? So if you came to this class thing, like, well, where the hell's the Talmud? Don't worry, we're getting there. So next week we'll actually kind of look at a little bit of like almost like a tour guide to what we're going to be looking at. I suspect that's probably as far as we're going to get next week. The following week, so 2 weeks from today, we'll actually get to dive right into the content itself. And by that point, you'll all be experts in like the spectrum of Jewish history and the different periods of rabbinic thought. And so as we start encountering these people, you'll all be great at it. So stay tuned for the answer to Peter's great question, which is like, is this thing even in the Torah? To be continued. Okay. Peter, Don, Alex.
Okay, so 2 comments. First of all, I loved your summary about the ability to study Talmud, and that's why we're all here. So that's the first comment. But the second comment refers to, I've forgotten exactly how it was worded, but it was the last slide you had on the screen about the later commentaries.
Yeah, the halacha is according to the later generations.
Thank you. That may be true, but even the later commentaries, even the later comments, I think, rather than commentaries, but even the later comments refer back to the earlier ones and ultimately back to Talmud and Torah.
Right. Which is why we still study the kernels, the seeds of it all, right? And you don't, but that is, again, this is a valid point of view, and I think many of us have parts of our lives where we behave similarly, right? You just do what somebody told you to do, right? You don't know all of the jurisprudence and the thought that went into that. Why? Because you trust that person. Well, they told you so, or you mimic them, right? I'm sure we all have examples in our lives of things that we do where if you really, really were pressed, you might not actually be able to explain why you do it. And you would say, well, it's something I saw my parents do, or it's something a teacher raised me up in doing. So that might be less satisfying from an intellectual perspective or a spiritual perspective. It's still valid, right? That people do things because they were acculturated to them. Yeah, great point. Dawn.
I love this popomo, this postmodern, whatever. Postmodern. I think that's fantastic. And I find it ironic that you are now not one of the kids, but that's okay. The one thing I would say, and I'm with you on this idea that we should open it all up. Everybody has this ability and access to study wherever they want, whatever they want. Losing those ideological lines I think is really helpful to how we study Torah or Talmud or anything. The one thing I would caution, though, is that we all didn't always have that access, and especially if you were born a woman, that we had to fight for that ability in every movement. I don't really want to put those those fences around reform conservative. I'm with you on that. I'm past it also. But at the same time, in my lifetime, there was a time when there were no women rabbis. There, Sally Presand was ordained in North America in 1972. I was already in my educational experience by the time she was ordained. So I just want to caution that there is a certain privilege to have been able to study. Yeah. And some of us were not able to access that for generations. And I think that what we're experiencing now is this flood, the golden age, this flood of being able to experience study in a way that is relevant to everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Alex.
Just one comment on this idea of closing the book on something, right? That the Talmud is closed. I think that across generations, the sages of the time did exactly that, right? They proclaimed that something was closed, typically the work that they did, and that there was no need to add or subtract anything because it was all there, right? And no sooner had the word been finished that there was someone else writing, a responsa or a new body of work that will prove that person wrong. It happened with the Mishnah. It happened with the Talmud. It happened with the Mishneh Torah. And by the way, each of them was a response of the previous claim that the work that had been just completed was it. There was no need for doing something further. And I wonder whether the guys who wrote that were writing it in jest, right? And they knew that it was going to happen anyway, so they said, yeah, this is close. But all of them did, funnily enough. And all of them were proven wrong.
Yeah. So this will be a lovely to be continued point for next week is that what Alex is describing, this idea that like there are these like peak moments in Jewish history where these scholars and these rabbis and these teachers say, oh, here is everything you need to know, right? Here is the guide, right? Up until the modern period, and that's when everything changes. But here is everything that you need to know. The question for us, if the big question is, why do Jews do X? Why do we behave the way that we do? The question related to Alex, your point is, well, why did people accept that? How did it come to be that people accepted that, right? You can be a famous rabbi or a not so famous rabbi and issue an edict, but it's only as good as that you have a community of people who say like, yeah, I agree with that. And that's kind of what we're looking at is how did these ideas and these practices come to be over time? How did people accept them and internalize them and change them and grapple with them? And grow. So it's 5 past the hour. I want to be respectful of people's time. Mom, you just put your hand up and I can't say no to you. So if you have to go, that's great. We'll see you next week, same time. We'll grapple with some of these big questions more. But Mom, I'll let you have the last word.
Just wanted to say it's wonderful to have you back teaching, and I'm so happy to see some new faces, like familiar faces, but new to this group. Welcome. If you have any friends inside or outside Colomie that you think might be interested in joining us, please, on Monday in Hashavua, there'll be another blurb. So you can certainly share the link. And on the registration page, there's a detailed description of what the course is about. So we'd love to have more people join us. So the one comment that I wanted to make was that even though we continue to interpret the law to this very day, and we'll continue to do so, we're not changing the laws, right? We're changing how they are realized in real life. So none of these commentators over the centuries ever said we're throwing this law out, right? That's where it differs.
Oh, sure they did. Yeah, no, sure they did. Absolutely.
But wasn't it about, okay, this is a law, we're not going to follow it this way anymore, we're going to follow it this way? Isn't there that difference between that and throwing the law out altogether?
This is a bigger question, right?
Yeah, I know it's not the question asked at the end of the class.
But again, but I will say it's a teaser question, and that's the scales tip in the very much so in the direction that you're suggesting, that as things change, it's more a function of interpretation and application, right? But there absolutely are examples of the former where rabbis seem to like wholesale do away with things from the Torah, right? Very clearly. And that's an interesting question where you say, look, how do you have the ability to do that? And that's kind of like the meta question that we're looking at is like, how did these changes happen over time? Not whether or not they did, but like, what is the growth and evolution? Yeah. But yeah, there are examples of like things that we would think like, yes, Carla, chutzpahdik, very, very chutzpahdik, right? Absolutely. Okay. Come back next week for more chutzpah, and look forward to seeing everybody then.
So glad to see
Thanks.
everybody. Welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, yeah,
Thank
really
you.
great.
It's so great.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.